All right, greetings, those of you who have joined and are joining. It is 12:01. We're going to give folks another minute or so to get in before we actually start, but we will start in 60 seconds. So until then, we just have to look at our mugs, I guess.
Did I get told you something?
We do not have a warm-up comedian for the crowd. Make a note for next year. Just wait another 30 seconds and get started. There's still some people getting let in. All right, well, I think everyone who's here at the moment is now in, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Richard Forsten. I'm an attorney with Saul, Ewing, Arnstein, and Lehr here in Wilmington. I've done a lot of property tax work over the years, and we've put this panel together for 60 to 90 minutes, just a quick update on where the counties are in the reassessment process, because Pam Scott, my partner who's here and will introduce herself in a moment, and we started to get some questions from property owners and realtors and others about where the reassessment process is, what it means, what should people be doing. And so we just thought it would be helpful to, over lunch, to kind of go over where we are in the process and try to answer those questions. There is a Q&A function in Zoom, and so if you do have questions, type them in, and we will try to answer them as we go along. As I said, my name is Richard Forsten, partner here at Saul Ewing, and I've done a lot of land use and commercial real estate and property tax appeals and property tax work over the years. And with me to my right, and I guess maybe you're right too, is my partner, Pam Scott.
Thank you, Richard. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. As Richard indicated, I am a partner at Saul Ewing, Arnstein, and Lehr in the Wilmington office. And like Richard, I have done a lot of work in commercial real estate and land use matters throughout the state, but more specifically in Newcastle County over the last 30 years or so. And happy to have you with us today as we sort of talk about where the counties are in this process. And we also have joining with us two gentlemen. I think I'll turn it over first to Greg Ellis with Patterson Woods. Greg, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Greg Ellis. I'm a commercial broker with Patterson Woods Commercial Properties, office in Greenville. I've been with them since 2005, was in corporate real estate with MB&A before that. And also I'm an owner investor in the Rockford Capital Partners investment fund. So have experience representing people as well as ownership experience to try and understand this issue.
Thank you, Greg. And we also have with us Phil McGinnis. Phil, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Phil McGinnis. I am the principal of McGinnis Commercial Real Estate Company, but probably more importantly for this audience is I am the owner of Dover Consulting Services, which is an appraisal firm. I've been in the real estate business now for, I think this is my 42nd year. And in fact, I'm emeritus with the National Association of Realtors. I don't get to pay dues anymore. But we've been doing appraisals. I'm a certified general appraiser, and I have a lot of work, a lot of experience in the courtroom litigating tax appeals and other such issues. So I'm very happy to be along for the ride, and we're ready to go.
Thank you, Phil.
All right, well, Pam and I have tried to kind of put together a list of questions to use to kick off various points of the discussion that we're going to go through today. And so the first question that various folks have asked is, what is a countywide reassessment, or what does it entail? And so right now, you get your tax bill every year in the mail, and you look at it and you say, wow, this is really low. My property is worth a lot more than this. The county must not know what it's doing. I'm not going to say or do anything because my assessment is so low. I'll just keep my head down. And to a certain extent, of course, that's true. Your current assessment is far less than your property's current fair market value. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the counties are doing a bad job, because each of the counties uses a different historical year as the year it assesses the property at its fair market value. So I would say right now in Newcastle County, if your house is worth $400,000, your assessed value is probably $80,000 to $100,000. And that's because back when 1983 is the base year in Newcastle County, assessments were being done. That's probably what that property was worth, but going on almost 40 years, obviously properties have increased in value. So that's what's going to happen with the reassessment then, is that instead of the current historical years that each county uses, you're going to be brought forward. It's not clear what base year the counties are going to use right now, or what date they intend to use for fair market value, but presumably it'll be 2022 or 2023, maybe even 2024. And so your assessment's going to go up, but as we're going to talk about, your tax bill probably isn't going to go up, because the rates are going to go down in proportion to the amount the assessment base comes up. So Pam, you want to talk a little
Sure.
more about base years?
So as Richard indicated, historically, the counties have established a base year for valuation of properties. Currently, Newcastle County uses July 1st, 1983. Kent County uses July 1st, 1987. And Sussex County uses July 1st, 1974. So the theory really is that property values, rise and fall in general proportional amount. So using a base year essentially means that once you've established the assessment, you don't really need to revisit that issue. And the only time a reassessment really occurs is when new properties come on the assessment rolls, or there's some renovations or substantial improvements to properties that would cause the reassessment process to kick in. So after the base year, only new construction or renovations are really getting assessed. And the vast majority of properties that are on the tax rolls really aren't being looked at again for purposes of their valuation. Of course, the problem here is, some areas properties values go up, some areas property values go down as time goes on, but that's, not being reflected in the valuation that the county currently has on their tax records for your properties. For example, in Newcastle County, the Charlie Square area was a really hot market with a lot of condos. But those condos didn't appreciate in value the way other properties did in, for example, the suburban areas, meaning that over time, houses in Hockessin or in Brain 100 were appreciating much more than these properties located in the city of Wilmington. But essentially, the properties end up paying sort of the same amount of taxes, so to speak. And Richard's going to go through a little bit in terms of the case law that has come out of this process over the last number of years.
Right. Obviously, the problem with the base year is the further away you get from the base year, the more properties will diverge in value. And so the system tends to break down, and Newcastle County their base year is 1983. Who would have thought in 1983 or 1985 that it would have been 30 some years before there was another countywide reassessment? And Sussex County, their base year is 1974. I don't think anybody at the time thought it was going to be 46 years or 47 years before they reassessed all the properties. So you can imagine if you're looking at a 1974 value for property, certain areas in any county, for example, the beach areas in Sussex County have gone way up in value as compared to properties, say, in the middle of the county or the western side of Sussex County. And in Newcastle County, the classic example is the Trolley Square area, where it's being said there was a lot of condominiums created in the early and mid 80s, and they were selling at a fair price. One woman whose name was Bailey challenged her assessment in 2002. She had bought her unit in the Trolley Square area for $85,000. It was assessed for $93,000. And in fact, when it had sold in 1985, the previous sale, it had sold for $115,000. So rather than go up in value, that property had gone down in value. But when she went before the Board of Assessment Review to challenge her appraisal or her assessment, the board basically said, tough luck. It's not our fault your property went down in value, and didn't do anything about it. And so she was stuck with her assessed value. And that's just one example. So you've got some homeowners, a lot of homeowners in the Trolley Square area who ended up paying more in property taxes compared to the fair market value, current fair market value of their property. Whereas folks in Hocassin or Brady 100, properties did keep going up, were paying less, relatively speaking. Another example, there was a hotel out on Route 202, motel, excuse me, it was a motel. And in the classic motel style, all of its doors opened to the outside, and business companies didn't want their business folks staying at those kind of places anymore for security reasons and whatnot. And it was a 138-room motel. The property owner who filed an assessment appeal had bought the property for $3 million in 1997, but the assessment was essentially $3.7 million. So again, because of changes in the market, that property had fallen in value, but in the absence of a reassessment, there's no way to just necessarily catch that. So again, they went through the Board of Assessment Review, and again, the Board of Assessment rebuffed them and rejected their appeal. I will say that motel eventually got torn down. There's a Wawa there and a small strip center there and some other stuff that replaced it. So maybe that story has a happy ending. But the point is that it's when you're using a base year system, the things will break down. We have argued and maintain that the way the system should work is you take the current fair market value today and then trend that back to 1983. And so I know, Phil, that's probably something that your firm has some experience doing, going back to the base year.
We've seen them go all the way. Yeah, I mean, we did the Walmart warehouse, the Walmart store down in Milford, the old one. And yeah, the county had done a cost approach and they had discounted the cost values back and then did the multiplication. We figured out what it was worth today, used Wall Street Journal and Bureau of Labor Statistics and all that kind of stuff to get a present value factor for 25 years ago or whatever it was when it was built. Oh, the good old days.
Well, again, turning to this problem or this issue of what happens over time, we had a case here in Wilmington where the Commerce building on Orange Street, those units were actually, it's an office building where each floor is its own condo unit. And those units were all sold in 1983. So the county took the position that what could be better? I've got a sale in the spring of 1983. Of course, that should be the assessed value of the property. And the problem, of course, and this is especially a problem, I think, for rental properties, offices and commercial, is that your fair market value depends on the rents you can get, and the rents you can get depend in part on your competition. And so when that building was built in 1983, you can run through a litany of properties that didn't exist in the city. The Manny building didn't exist, and other buildings. So that has an effect on value when competition opens up. None of the MD&A buildings were here. And then the owner of one of the units in that building, when he went to file his tax appeal, said, my property is now 30 years old and it's got 30 years worth of depreciation. It's obsolete. It's got all these other issues. So I'm going to take what its fair market value is today, and I'm going to trend that back to 1983 so that I capture the property's current condition as part of its assessment. The county resisted that. The county said, no, you can't do that. I mean, we've got your 1983 value, too bad. But the Delaware Supreme Court said no, that when you're figuring out an assessed property's value, you have to take all relevant factors into account, and that includes depreciation and includes things like that. So again, by relying on a base year that now is older than kids in high school, the system broke down, and you had people who were overassessed or paying too much in taxes if their assessment was lower. Again, if there's any kind of good news here, or you're wondering maybe why this hasn't been a bigger issue for property owners, I mean, we're lucky in Delaware. Sometimes we forget that our property taxes are low compared to most of the region. I mean, go across the line into Pennsylvania, taxes are much higher. Go to New Jersey. I mean, I talked to some of my partners who live in New Jersey, and I shudder at the property taxes that they pay on their houses. So because property taxes are so low here, it's oftentimes not the case that it's economical to even go through the process. If your tax bill is, if you're a homeowner and you're paying $400 more in taxes a year than you probably should be paying, is the view worth the climb? Are you going to want to go through the process because it's not inexpensive and it can be time consuming? You'll need someone like Greg or Phil to provide some expert opinion to the board about what the true assessed value should be. And so it gets difficult for smaller property owners to justify that burden. At the same time, if you've got a property and it's got a big assessment and that assessment is off, it may easily justify taking the time to go through the process. Right now in Newcastle County, every $1 million worth of assessment is a tax bill of at least, it depends on the school district a little bit, but at least $31,000 to $32,000 a year. So if you have a property that the county has assessed at $15 million and you think it's only $12 million, I mean, that's an annual tax savings of 90-some thousand dollars a year, well worth having the argument with the county about what the proper assessment should be. And it's definitely worth taking the time and trouble to appeal.
Well, and I was wondering, Greg, in terms of you're working with clients in the commercial and industrial field, does this come up very much about assessed values in the counties that you're working in, and how valuation is determined? Or is it just like, oh, wow, this is so much lower than what I'm used to, this is great?
Yeah, that's definitely a part of it. I think a lot of people in the commercial world, very often the tenants are ultimately paying the taxes. The owners, if they're savvy, have figured out a way to pass that expense through, or at least cap that expense at a certain point in time, so any increases or fluctuations get passed through. For the most part, people don't stress about it. As you said, taxes are generally cheap. When people who own numerous buildings realize the disparity between, say, an office condo in downtown Wilmington or small freestanding building in the county, and I'm not talking about the tax rate, the assessment rates can be quite different.
Right.
Then they might try and appeal. Often they'll talk to people such as yourselves or other appraisers and realize that it is a really uphill climb. And you get into all kinds of crazy theory about how do I take today's value and backdate it? Is it strictly inflationary? Do I look at actual market statistics? How do I factor in depreciation? I mean, there's so many theories. And the county, you can probably speak even more to this than I can. They just take forever. There's no time frame. There's no statutory response time frame or deadline to respond or approve or deny your application. So I've seen applications be out there for multiple years. And, where, I mean, we were involved in one little property on King Street that, it was one of those row houses on King Street. Somebody had spent like $2 million, crazy, insane amount of money fixing it up. Ultimately was worth about $500,000. So the assessment was sort of all over the place. By the time we won the appeal, we had already sold the property and didn't own it anymore. So it comes up and people do it, but I think, Richard, you nailed it on the head. It's not often worth the climb.
By the way, Glenn, people don't realize that there are statutory deadlines in the Delaware Code.
Okay.
And they were written in a different era. I mean, a completely different era, because what they provide is that each county is supposed to get assessment notices to all property owners and post-assessment notices by a certain date. I want to say it's March 1st. And then you have a certain amount of time to file your appeal. In Newcastle County, you have to file your appeal on or by March 14th. And then, and I think in Kent and Sussex, you might have till April 1st. But then the boards of assessment review are supposed to meet for 30 or 45 days to resolve all appeals, because the way the statute is written, the finance department or the assessment division is supposed to then certify to the county councils or to levy court in Kent County the actual assessment roll, so that then the county officials, levy court or council members know, if we use this tax rate and this is the tax base, this is how much money we should generate. But I have never known.
But does the appeals board have a time frame to approve or deny an appeal?
Well, again, in theory, if you read the statute, they're supposed to resolve all appeals within a month. I mean, and so that has never worked. And but it probably worked in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1910s, when these statutes were first put in place.
But there's no teeth to it that says I automatically win my appeal if you don't resolve it within a certain time frame.
That's such rush. No.
Oh, but it also only takes a minute to send you the rejection denied letter.
Right.
Too. I mean, it doesn't take very long to type out denied.
Right.
That is true. That is true.
But Richard, let me take Greg's point just another step further. I have, we do a lot of leasing down here and we do some management as well. And I even have 2 tenants that are on net leases that pay the taxes, and their definitions of common area maintenance and pass-throughs and whatnot include that the landlord would not send the cop or try to pass through the cost of property tax appeals as part of the common area maintenance charges.
Right.
So while you'd think they'd want to encourage property tax appeals to reduce that part of their load, they don't want to pay for it either. So.
Yep.
Right.
Understood.
I guess on a net lease, there's no incentive for the landlord to appeal the taxes anyway.
Yeah.
Right, and in, in looking at leases too, I'll just say, again, Delaware, not only is our tax rate low, and so we have low property taxes relatively speaking, but because we use the base year system, once you get your assessment, you kind of know what your tax burden is going to be, subject to increases in the tax rate. Other states and other parts of the country do different things, and so in California, they have what's called the welcome neighbor system, where your assessed value is the purchase price you paid for the property. And so you can have 10 people living on the same street in the same subdivision in California, and they will all be paying different amounts of taxes depending on when they move in. And so somebody bought their house in 1990 is paying based on 1990 fair market value. Somebody bought in 1995 is probably paying more, 2000 more. Somebody who just moved in is going to then be paying property taxes based on the current fair market value that they just paid, which is why the system is called welcome neighbor, because you like your neighbors moving in because now they're paying a lot more in taxes. And that has been upheld as not a violation, at least under the federal constitution. It would violate the Delaware Constitution, which is one of the reasons we don't have that system.
So, property assessments are designed to basically divide up the tax burden so that people are paying their fair share of taxes based on the relative value of their properties as compared to others. Then the more time that passes, obviously, the less precise the assessments become. A county-wide reassessment is the county looking again at the value of the property, every property on the tax rolls, with a new fair market value as of the base year. In terms of the base year, I don't think it's quite certain yet what that's going to be in each of the counties. I think Newcastle County is looking at potentially July 1st, 2023, if they can stay on schedule with the work that's being done. I believe Kent and Sussex counties are both looking at July 1st of 2024, based on their current schedule. But that hasn't been firmed up as of this point. That's just based on the information we have now. That's where we see it going.
And so the question is, how did we get here? And we've talked about the fact that the base years each of the counties has been using is so old. From time to time over the years, we've had clients say, well, why don't we sue? And then once we explain to them what a lawsuit would entail to force reassessment, they realize why nobody has sued to force reassessment. But that changed in connection with education, and a group called sued the Department of Education and the state and each of the counties over educational funding, particularly for the city of Wilmington. And as part of that lawsuit, they also alleged that because the assessment system is so poorly done, school districts aren't able to raise sufficient funds, or it's hard for school districts to raise sufficient funds. And so therefore, Your Honor, you should order each of the counties to reassess. And so on May 8th, 2020, lost in all the shuffle of the pandemic and everything that was happening, because remember, this all started, I'll say the pandemic started in March of 2020. So less than 2 months after that started, the Chancery Court issued an opinion finding in part or stating in part that the counties should reassess, that their current system was so out of whack as to violate the Delaware Constitution. And there are statistics you can use that mass appraisers and professionals use to measure how accurate an overall assessment system is. You look at the sales price of properties and you compare them to their assessed value. And the more that ratio is the same, the more accurate your assessment base is, because that's, let's say that every property sold for $200,000 and its assessed value was $100,000. And if every property was selling for that same 2-to-1 ratio, then professionals, appraisers, and statisticians would conclude that the assessment is very accurate, because everybody is selling for approximately the same ratio as their assessed value. That has not been the case for the longest time in any of the counties when it comes to commercial properties. They sell for their assessed value versus their sales price has been all over the place. But nobody had brought a lawsuit until this educational lawsuit. I will say that when it comes to home values, even though we know there are pockets where the system had broken down, for example, Trolley Square in Wilmington, overall, the residential home value numbers were, I'm going to say, okay. They weren't great, but they never quite reached the level where it was a lay down hand and a court was going to order a countywide reassessment. But you put them together, that is commercial and residential, and you have a court that is looking to solve educational funding issues. And so the court ordered countywide reassessments in May of 2020.
Well, and interestingly enough, no one appealed that decision. All the parties ultimately decided to settle and then come up with a schedule, I think, of how the process was going to work.
Well, yeah, they didn't appeal because it was interlocutory. It was only part of the case. So the court issued its decision on reassessment, but there were still other claims that needed to be resolved. So it wasn't a kind of final order that would lead to an appeal. But, I think the counties all knew it was the right thing to do. But, if you're an elected politician, are you going to order reassessment, or are you going to do what the court tells you and then say, well, I'm doing reassessment because the courts have told me to do reassessment? I know Newcastle County had been looking at the issue even before the lawsuit was filed. And so one of the reasons that they seem a little bit further ahead in the process than the other two counties is because they had started investigating the process even before the lawsuit was filed, and they were ready to move forward on that. But then the parties have settled the lawsuit entirely. So they've settled the educational funding issues in terms of the state agreeing to give the city of Wilmington additional funds to reflect the fact that so many of the students in the city come from poorer families. And so some educational theorists will tell you that means you need to have more spending on education to account for that. And then as part of the overall settlement, each of the counties also agreed now to do the reassessments. And so they're in the very early stages of that.
And they all retain the same contractor, Tyler Technologies, basically to perform the reassessment work for them.
So one of the questions that people ask, and obviously tenants ask under their leases, especially where it's a CAM pass-through, but homeowners ask all the time is, are my taxes going to go up? How much are my taxes going to go up? And I remember talking to some folks when this story kind of first came out who were convinced, because their assessment was only $100,000, but their house was worth, $400,000, that their tax bill was going to go up 4 times. So they're paying $2,000 now, and suddenly they're going to have to start paying $8,000, and this was an outrage. And how could this happen? And we can't let this happen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But reassessments under Delaware law are supposed to be revenue neutral. And so when you think about the taxes raised every year, you've got an assessment base, and you multiply that assessment base times a tax rate, and that ends up with the amount of money, assuming everybody paid 100%. But that tells you the total revenue then that the county government will receive. So if the tax base is going to go up 4-fold, then in order to be revenue neutral, the tax rate has to go down or divided by 4 so that the math will still work out to the same number. That keeps it revenue neutral. And that's what's supposed to happen. Now, if you talk to the folks at Tyler Technologies, and I was on a panel with them a couple years ago. I mean, and you talk to other appraisers such as Phil. I mean, my understanding, Phil, is that the kind of rule of thumb is that as a result of any reassessment, it's all about everybody's relative value to make sure everybody is paying the same rate. And so what I have always heard is that as a result of a reassessment, about 1/3 of people will see their tax bills go up. 1/3 will see their tax bills stay approximately the same. And 1/3 of property owners will see their tax bills actually go down as a result of the reassessment. Phil, is that
Yeah,
right?
theoretically, logically, that's, the way you average out to 0. And that's sort of the argument we've always used. I can't tell you that I actually see that through experience, but
We haven't done a reassessment in almost 40 years, so.
no, and I remember when we were traveling to Dover for those 2 and 3 hour marathons once a month back in the early 90s. That was the generally accepted arithmetic, to get to revenue neutral.
Well, and I will say that there's a caveat to all of this because the Delaware code does say that a county doesn't have to make it perfectly revenue neutral. They could actually increase taxes by up to 15% if they want.
Pay for the reassessment.
Now,
Yeah, I think they have to pay for the reassessment, right?
well, not only that, but they can just increase the
Okay.
taxes. But
Without a
obviously, anytime the county councils and the levy court have the power to do that anyway. And they can
Right.
always raise your tax rate. So the fact that counties have that authority in the reassessment legislation doesn't particularly surprise me or trouble me because, voters are going to see what they're doing and they're going to look at their tax bills. And if if Newcastle County tries to include a 10% or 15% tax increase as part of the reassessment, voters are going to take notice. I do know that Newcastle County passed a resolution saying that they would keep this strictly revenue neutral. I'm not aware that Kent or Sussex has actually passed anything, but even if they did, a resolution is not binding. And they can always change their mind. But at least Newcastle County has said they're going to try to keep things revenue neutral. Now, school districts, of course, and I will say, I didn't say this in the introduction, but I sit on the school board. And if we want to raise taxes, we have to go out to a referendum and persuade the voters that their taxes need to go up. And here's why. I actually like that system because I think it keeps us honest and we have to make the case and it causes us to think things through carefully before we ask. But as part of a reassessment, the Delaware Code says that school districts can raise taxes by up to 10% without the need to go out to a referendum. And I have said publicly at school board meetings, and at least I think one of my fellow school board members said the same thing. I mean, if we're given that option, I'm not going to support having taxes go up without a referendum. And I quite frankly think any school board would be foolish to do so because you're going to still need other referendums to pass in the future to fund construction and do things like that. And for better or worse, I think the majority of voters also like the referendum process. And if you try to backdoor them with a tax increase surreptitiously or with this caveat, an automatic 10 up to an automatic 10% increase, I don't think that's going to sit well with voters. But I will say that I've had at least one politician suggest to me, oh, isn't this a great idea, Shark? Because now you don't have to worry about referendums as much. So I'll say people can disagree about it, but there is there is that caveat.
But I think we would be interested though to hear what Phil or you, Greg, might be hearing from clients now about, concerns about this process and what impact it may have on them, or maybe you're not hearing much of anything, but be interested to hear what you guys have to say on that.
Yeah, I'm not hearing much of anything, surprisingly. It hasn't really, I don't think the media has been covering it all that much. They've covered a little bit, but no, businesses and tenants and investors haven't really been asking questions about it yet. I think most people will just be surprised when it actually comes out. I mean, I've certainly seen in the media about canvassers going around neighborhoods, measuring houses, asking how many bathrooms you have. I've yet to see any anywhere, but I've heard that it's happening somewhere. But what I on this panel, so I should know the answer, but I haven't even heard what they're going to do with the commercial owners. I mean, are they going to be sending out surveys asking for income? Because most commercial property is the income method is the best way to determine the value. Is it going to be, their estimate of construction value or just a arm's length market value? And how are they going to get their data? What are they going to do to inspect the property? So nobody's asking that yet, but I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out.
Right. And Greg, in partial answer to that question, we have some, even though we know that there is about to be a reassessment, and so any current assessment might only last another 2 or 3 years, we have a couple of clients for whom we have filed appeals because their property is overassessed, and the potential savings does justify the time and effort. But we've also told those clients that the county may be coming to you for information, but even if it wasn't coming to you for information, if you give them information, again, as we talked about earlier, we're starting with current fair market value and then trending it back to 1983. So they will have received current fair market value for 2021 or 2022 about your property. And you'd like to think that armed with that information, then when they go to do the reassessment, if they're using 2022 as the base year, for example, and you just gave them information for 2021 or in some cases 2022, that they would certainly use that as the starting point when they're figuring out what the assessed value of your property should be. I also know that back in the early 80s, when the last reassessment was done, that they did do a lot of surveying of property owners in terms of rental rates and things like that. And they still have somewhere in the county, I've never actually seen it, but they still have this study that they put together that they use when they're trying to figure out the 1983 fair market value.
Well, and in response to your question, Greg, they are, in addition to sending people to properties, to physically inspect them, like for the commercials and others, they are sending out surveys and asking very specific information and advising people that the information that's being requested will remain strictly confidential, et cetera, et cetera. I remember the county executive in Newcastle County being a bit frustrated about this process, saying, I don't know why they have to visit every property. We already have plenty of information. We can see things from aerial surveys. Why do they actually have to physically go to every property? But that is really part of the process that is, I think, extending the timeline in a lot of these scenarios in terms of when it's getting completed.
There are over 180,000 individual tax parcels in Newcastle County. That number goes up every year as property is subdivided and whatnot. And I've read that their intention is to visit every property, but you can imagine the army of people that you need and the number of properties you would have to visit on a daily basis if you're really going to meet that goal of visiting every single property. But I also remember as a kid when we moved to Delaware, my father got transferred back to Delaware by DuPont. So this was a long time ago. that I remember we had just moved into the house, we were unwrapping boxes and putting things on away. And somebody from the county knocked on the door to inspect the house because it had just gotten its CO a couple of days before we moved in. So they used to do it all the time. I don't really think they do it much anymore.
Take the key.
Phil?
Yeah, I don't.
Well,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead, Greg.
No, I was just gonna say, I think in large measure, the county doesn't actually know what's going on at most properties. And somebody does need to lay eyes on them. But, with commercial, the valuation, it's not like houses, especially in a tract neighborhood where most of the houses are basically similar, plus or minus a bathroom or a finished basement or something. But, a commercial, two buildings right next door to each other can have incredibly different market values depending on who the tenant is inside, whether it's owner occupied or whether there's a tenant in there paying a crazy amount of rent, and how they reconcile that. It's going to be interesting. And I'm sure you all will be incredibly busy with appeals after this all happens.
Yay. But Tyler has been doing the city of Dover. The city of Dover is one jurisdiction in the state that reassesses every 5 years. Come hell or high water, they're going to reassess. And they do about 20% of the properties each year. And on the 5th year, bada bing, here comes your reassessment. And we argued fair market value because, in the city of Dover, we don't have the same rent structure, especially for upper Newcastle County and eastern lower Sussex County, the beach area. And, so we're looking at assessments based on $26 and $30 a square foot rents when we're really getting 15 and 18 bucks. And so we developed a form, to try to get property owners to send in their rents. And it is confidential, and I get property owners, look what the city's doing to me now. And I'm saying, yeah, send it in, or you're going to come see me later because you're going to get assessed based on 26 or 30 bucks a foot rent, or tell them what your rents are and let them calculate a more palatable market rent ratio.
Right.
Oh, they won't use it against me. And I said, well, it depends on how you see it as against you. Is it helping you or is it hurting you?
And we had a number of cases, Phil, on that point in the early 90s for some of the office buildings here in the city of Wilmington, where the county was just assuming that the rents that these buildings were getting was X. And in fact, the case law tells you, and in part these cases now tell you, that you have to look at actual rents because you're trying to figure out the actual fair market value of a particular property.
Right.
So the county lost a string of cases in the early 90s because we were able to demonstrate that the actual rents received are what mattered and what gave the property its value. So it does behoove folks to play ball and report that information. And because it is sensitive financial information, it is exempted from FOIA. And so if somebody were to make a FOIA request about what are the rents in such and such building, it would not be subject to disclosure under the Freedom of Information Act. So folks don't have to worry about giving out trade secrets when they do that.
Right.
The other thing apparently that each of the counties is doing is a sales study over a 30-month period. For Newcastle County, the 30-month period ends June 30, 2022. And in Kent and Sussex, it ends in 2023. Now that's an interesting time frame considering what's been happening over the last 2 years and how it's affected property values. But that also is part of this process that they're moving ahead with.
Right. And again, it suggests that people just have to be paying attention. I will say they do a study every year already. Ed Ratledge and the folks down at the University of Delaware. The counties, because of the transfer tax form, essentially know the sales price of every residential property that has sold in their county for as long as they've been collecting that information. And so that's why when I said earlier that the residential properties, their assessed values, they were at the borderline, but they tended to be on the okay side of that borderline in terms of complying with the mandates for fairness and taxation. Because the counties have so much data about residential property values that it's, I'm gonna say it's harder for them to get that wrong. Commercial property depends so much on income and condition of the building and has it been maintained that, you know, two properties that were both brand new in, 1983, one because of competition across the street and competing properties might become run down and the other might still be a first-class property. There's so many variables that aren't captured necessarily by a simple sales price the way that it is in residential. But that's, that's just the way it goes, I'm going to say. I do think, though, if folks have questions about whether they should answer or supply information that they get from these counties, and that I'm not aware that any has gone out yet, but you're certainly free to call us or call Greg or call Phil, and we'll try to help you with that. And again, we're very early in the process, but at least some people have started asking us, well, what am I going to do if I think my new assessment is too high? And what should I, so they say, what should I be doing now? And the answer is, well, look at your current assessment, and if it justifies an appeal, you should always appeal. But if it doesn't, particularly where there's going to be a new reassessment in the next 2 years, maybe you just tough it out for 2 years. But hope that you're one third of properties whose tax bill goes down. But if your current assessment is too high now, you should certainly consider appealing it, doing the cost benefit analysis. And then we know that each of the counties, of course, Tyler's doing all three of the counties, the same company. They do intend to have some sort of informal process for property owners where property owners have they'll get some sort of heads up. Here's what we think your assessed value is going to be. Right. And then you'll have the opportunity to come in and I guess plead your case. Now, I'm going to say be careful what you wish for in terms of Tyler Technologies, because if you send out 180,000 notices in Newcastle County, if 5% of the people respond to that, that's going to be 9,000 people who want to have informal meetings. If 2% of the folks who get those notices respond, then I think that's going to be 3,800 people, if I'm doing the math right in my head. That's a lot of informal meetings. And again, it goes to say kind of the nature of the beast. I mean, you've got a lot of properties that need to be reassessed, and it's just going to take time. So that's why I know that Newcastle County had talked about getting this effective with July 1, 2023, but that's 15 months away. And we've talked about the fact they have to inspect every property, or want to inspect every property. They got to get notices out to people. They got to get through all of that. They haven't sent out any questionnaires to property owners that we're aware of. So I suspect that given the inordinate amount of work that's required, you're not going to see any new reassessments become effective until July 1, 2024.
You might want to, it's about 5 of 1, so I don't know if we want to see if anyone has any questions at this point, or.
Yeah, I may have erred at the beginning of this of our start here by getting to tell people that there is a Q&A section in Zoom, and so if you do have questions, if you type them in to the Q&A box, I think if you go to the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's an icon will pop up for Q&A, and you can type in a question. Please feel free to do that, because I'm sure that us just talking, we may not have answer the specific question or questions that you may have. And then, of course, when we're done, you can always reach out to us anyway to do that. I guess, kind of as we get towards the end of the presentation here, if I'm a landlord or a commercial real estate property owner, what should I be doing right now? And I know, Greg, you hit upon it a little bit ago, but I would be reviewing my leases on the CAM provisions just to see what they say. Again, in theory, this is all supposed to be tax revenue neutral, but if you're a first-class shopping center, state of the art, you may go up compared to other shopping centers which are older and have depreciated. So landlords ought to be checking their CAM provisions in their leases. But Greg, what other thoughts might you have?
Sorry, I had to unmute. No, I think that's the number one thing. Trying to gather the information that they may want to share with the assessors, as you said, so they can, instead of just reacting at the last minute, trying to figure out what about their property is worth sharing, and knowing what your pass-throughs are, how you can pass through taxes, whether any limitations on the ability to pass through as a result of a reassessment. That's going to be important. I think it's important for owners, existing owners, to look at that and familiarize themselves with that. I would say it's even more critical if you're getting into buying a property, is if you're assessing the value of the property and what you want to pay for it, is understanding how that could impact your future income. You may know what your income is today, but you want to have some sense of how your income is going to change in the future. If you can pass through all the tax changes, then it's not really going to impact you one way or another. If there's tax savings, will that accrue to you or to the tenants? If there are tax increases, will that cost you or cost the tenants? Understanding that, so how your valuation may change in the future, I think is really important. So looking at those leases, especially as a buyer, is very critical.
All right, Phil, did you have any other thoughts on that issue?
No, I think Greg hit it spot on. You're going to need to know what you can assess as common area maintenance, whether it's an appeal or whatnot. And I guess, if there are any commercial brokers out there, you probably ought to, I have a couple of buildings that are gross rents, so they can't pass the taxes through. So I'm telling my guys, I got the Duncan Center down here in Dover, and I got to submit a budget about every 3 months. And I'm telling them, we're probably going to be able to knock the taxes down because the building's mostly vacant. But, even if you if you have a gross lease property, be prepared.
Well, hopefully you're one of the lucky properties that see their tax bill go down. And so kind of, final thoughts. We've mentioned this a couple of times. The good news is property taxes in Delaware are generally on the lower side. And I know a real estate closing attorney in Sussex County who likes to joke that when people look at the settlement sheet when they're buying their house and they look at the line for property taxes, they say, well, that's just monthly, right? And he says, no, that's annual. And they're all are amazed. I will suspect that if anybody in Delaware is going to see a property tax increase, I would bet that, oceanfront and beachfront and really close to the beach properties in Rehoboth and Lewis and, Fenwick and Bethany and all those areas, they will see higher tax bills, particularly compared to their neighbors in the western part of the county. So I think that'll be an adjustment. But again, Sussex County, they make Newcastle County look high when it comes to property taxes.
Well, they raised the median sale price all over the state. Those 200 or 300.
That's a good thing for Sussex County, and our whole state should take pride in the fact that our property taxes are relatively low. And I will say sometimes at meetings, I get frustrated because, we have lots of people move down to Delaware from New Jersey and New York and Pennsylvania. And I mean, they see huge decreases in their property tax bill to the point where they're almost indifferent to property tax increases. And they'll say things like, well, even if taxes increase, it's still so much lower than where I came from. And I just look at them and say, but I like my low taxes and I'd like to keep them low. Thank you. But so if you're a property owner with property close to the beach in Sussex County, your tax bill is probably going to go up, although I don't know that it's going to break you. If you're a condo owner in the Trolley Square area, I think your property tax bill is probably going to go down. For most of us, we'll probably see, either a slight increase or maybe a modest decrease. But this process is still unfolding, and I suspect that as the county starts to reach out to property owners for information, or because they want to come and inspect the property, that more people will start to pay attention to this. But obviously, for the last 2 years, we've all had something much more important on our minds. And so it doesn't surprise me that a lot of people aren't following this all that closely. But I think enough are starting to pay attention now that's why we thought we might have this webinar. And Pam and I are available for, people have questions either later this afternoon or in the months or years ahead. But Pam, did you have any?
Or when you actually get your notice telling you what the new valuation is of your property.
Yeah, I imagine we'll get a lot of calls then.
That's probably the trigger point, I suspect.
Greg, did you have any other final thoughts you wanted to observe?
No, I think, thanks for the opportunity and the information. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
And Phil, we'll give you the last word.
I hope everybody is weathering the COVID storm very well. We're getting to the end of that. And as we roll from one avalanche to the next, take a moment and get a deep breath of fresh air and get yourself ready to go again.
And so with that, everybody, we will say adieu. But let me just check the questions and see if anybody's, I don't check. No, nobody ever asked us questions.
No.
So hopefully this has been informative and has given you a sense of what's going to be happening in the next 2 years. And we will see you all hopefully in the future. Thanks, Phil.
See ya.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, everybody. Yep.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you all. Take
Bye.
care.
Bye.
Be safe.
Here.
See ya.